This video is for students in the course Self-Service. It was good to see you all yesterday on Zoom. Today is Saturday. It's about noon. The sun was out earlier but seems to have gone away. I'm sitting out here on my back deck and wanted to share some thoughts with you now that I've read through your thesis statements for the essay on Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day in connection with Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. The first thing I want to talk about is potential topics for this paper. You are not locked in to the topic that you wrote about in your thesis statement. And after you watch this video, you may decide that you want to change topics, and that's totally fine. Or you may decide that you want to tweak your thesis a little bit, or maybe you're happy with your thesis. But hopefully the following thoughts on the writing process will be useful to you, regardless of where you land in terms of your thesis statement. So here are some other topics to consider. And I have a long list here, but I'm just going to go through a couple of them. And again, just a reminder, I'm happy to talk with you individually over the phone or via email, whatever works for you. So a couple of potential topics. Think about, in addition to the pleasure principle, Freud's notion that human beings seek an absence of pain and suffering, and that the most acute source of suffering, according to Freud, is the relationships that people have with others. So there are different options for dealing with that source of pain and suffering. One of them, as he notes, is self-isolation, which is a term that has sort of taken on new meaning in this era of COVID-19. Obviously, Freud didn't have that in mind, but isolating oneself as a kind of defense mechanism against the pain that can come from other people and from maybe having one's heart broken or feeling neglected or used or disappointed by other people. Or like one has hurt others. That sense of guilt can also be a source of pain. And then the other option, which Freud suggests is much better, is to join a community. And that's something that Mr. Stevens thinks about at the very end of The Remains of the Day as he's sitting on the pier observing people. Another possible topic is this notion that Freud picks up of individual freedom being at odds with collective responsibility. Freedom versus the security that civilization affords. And he raises this question of, can these conflicting claims coexist? And I see this playing out with Mr. Stevens in terms of his, for his entire career up until this trip that he takes, from the moment he wakes up until the moment he goes to bed, fulfilling responsibilities. And it isn't until he takes this trip that he actually has time to think about his life. He has the luxury of free time. It's the first time that he really experiences freedom. Another potential topic is human beings' aggressive nature. And this is one of the more controversial points, I think, in Civilization and Its Discontents, when Freud says that when you strip away the limitations placed on the individual by society, what's left is a savage beast, which is really grim. But he offers a number of examples over history of human beings doing terrible things to other human beings, and the perpetrators being led by charismatic leaders. Nonetheless, I do see this playing out if you think about the way that people in positions of power in The Remains of the Day use and manipulate others for their own ends, and it even plays out on a smaller scale with Mr. Stevens. If you think about his personal relationships and the way that he treats other people, it's not always generous. In fact, his moments of being kind and generous are few and far between. So that's one way of reading Mr. Stevens. And I recognize that that's a bit cynical. And then one last potential topic, think about Freud's notion that the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or to, more specifically, to love thy neighbor as thyself is anathema to human nature. It goes against basic human nature according to Freud, and that those who do their best to abide by it actually put themselves at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their relationship with others who ignore that rule. And the disillusionment that inevitably befalls those who have tried to abide by the rule but realize that they're, he says, neighbors or fellow human beings are not playing by the same rules and are using them. And I think about Mr. Stevens' realization, again, toward the end of the novel, about how Lord Darlington made mistakes and Mr. Stevens just went along with them, thinking that Lord Darlington was doing what was right and noble, but perhaps he wasn't. So that's not an exhaustive list, but just a couple of topics there for you to think about as you reflect on your own thesis statement. Maybe you want to amend it. You certainly can. In terms of how you go about structuring your essay, I think you should begin with Freud. That's just a recommendation. You could begin with The Remains of the Day, but if I were writing this, I'd begin with a Freudian idea, and I would make sure that I understand it as well as I possibly can. I would spend some time with the excerpts, the packet that I provided from Freud, and if you aren't sure about what something means, you can certainly look up terms, and you can reach out to classmates, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to help you with that, but it would be a shame if you wrote an essay that hinged on a reading of Freud that wasn't accurate. So just like back when you wrote your essays on The River Between, it was critical that you understood what the scholar Apollo Amoko was suggesting. Here, Freud's language perhaps isn't quite as challenging, but some of these ideas may be new to you. So it's important to understand what it is you're attributing to Freud. Then I would introduce The Remains of the Day and Mr. Stevens, or whatever particular aspect of the novel you plan to discuss, and begin examining how his character follows the Freudian model or doesn't. And Stevens may in some ways, but not in others, and that's okay. You are encouraged to revisit Freud in your essay and cite him or quote him again, and maybe even a third or fourth time as you progress through your essay. You're not limited to one quotation or one single idea from Freud, so keep that in mind, okay? Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. You can trace the progression of a line of thought or inquiry, such as Freud begins by explaining the pleasure principle, and that might lead to a discussion of how Mr. Stevens derives pleasure or satisfaction or even feelings of exhilaration. And we talked about those two moments yesterday in Zoom when he feels a sense of triumph at having done his job so well, which then might lead you to a discussion of, well, what is he basing that sense of triumph on? Well, he feels like he has attained dignity. And what is dignity for him? I would relate that to the Freudian notion of ideals, that this represents civilization having progressed and reached an advanced stage, that human beings are striving for more than just beauty, cleanliness, and order, but they're after something religious or philosophical. And the pursuit of dignity is a kind of religion for Mr. Stevens. So there I'm connecting my discussion back to Freud, and then I would think about, well, how did this value of dignity that Mr. Stevens strives to embody come to be in him? Is it from his father? Probably. Is it from society? Certainly. And what are the implications of it? It's really important to consider the end of The Remains of the Day. Please do not just limit your discussion of the novel to early chapters and leave it at that. You've got to think about the ending because it's so dramatic and important in understanding the novel. If you haven't yet read the article that I shared out from The Guardian, it's written by Ishiguro about the writing of the remains of the day, you really should read that, because he talks about a decision that he made when he was writing the novel to have Mr. Stevens, quote, come unbuttoned toward the end. Initially, Ishiguro was going to have Mr. Stevens stay emotionally buttoned up until the very end, and then he listened to Ruby's Arms, a song by Tom Waits, and that changed his thinking about Mr. Stevens. It's a fascinating article. Check it out. And it shows you the importance of the end of the remains of the day, because for Mr. Stevens, he comes undone in two different ways. One, with respect to Miss Kenton, when he says his heart was breaking, and then the second, talking to this acquaintance, this unnamed butler at the very end in chapter day 6, Weymouth, when he starts crying because he feels like he gave his best years to Lord Darlington, and Mr. Stevens never even made his own mistakes. And where is the dignity in that? So at some point, perhaps toward the end of your essay, you really need to consider the end of the remains of the day. Embrace complexity. It's okay to have a nuanced interpretation of Ishiguro's novel relative to Freud and Freudian theory. It's okay to conclude that Ishiguro aligns with Freud in a certain way but not another, or that he aligns in various ways that seem connected to you. And I just gave an example of such a line of thinking. Finally, this is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your understanding of the remains of the day on a psychological level, as the novel is a journey into Mr. Stevens' mind. So this is your chance to show how carefully you've read and how you've been thinking about this novel and its import on whatever level you think is important, but I think certainly you need to touch on psychology and what's going on inside Mr. Stevens' psyche as he takes this journey of 6 days, which is really a journey through the years back into his memory, leading him up to this dramatic realization. And then lastly, maybe think about the very end, where he commits himself to studying the art of bantering so that he can please his new master, his new employer, Mr. Faraday, and what that might signify. So I hope those thoughts are helpful for you. Feel free to reach out to me at any point if you want to talk about your argument and approach individually. Otherwise, I'll plan to see you Tuesday morning for our next Zoom session. Have a great rest of the weekend. Bye.